Hello, test, test, test. I don't know if anyone is out there. Apparently, my live stream I tried to do before did not come through. I'm going to see here if I can get this out to some people and see if they can help me figure this out. I'm texting my family because family is always the one who's going to tell you like it is. And I guess I should just, so this is where the first stream I said, my husband's not here and he's the one who's the techie. So, and I've been down with the migraine all day today. So I'm kind of operating on halfway functioning here. So, we'll see. Let me pull up my YouTube here and see if I am having any sound. I think I hear it now. I think I hear it now. All right, so now I'm going to share this on Facebook, seeing if I can get anyone out there. I know you guys so patiently let's see if I can get anyone out there. Okay. Well, maybe I'll do better the second take here. All right, so let me just post this on one more place, and then we'll take a second. We'll get going here. Thank you if you tried to join into the first one or try to watch the first one and saw that there was no sound. And hopefully you're not going to hear my dog freaking out over here because there's fireworks going on in the neighborhood because they've canceled all of the community fireworks in our area here in Baltimore. And so in round one. And oh, thank you. My family is listening to my brother who was hoping I'd talk about nicer things. Sorry. All right. Let's see here. I can't talk and text at the same time. Okay. All right. So if you're just going to join me here, I'll try and do a little shortened version of what I was doing before, and I will also put my sources in my comments. The reason why I decided to do Coffee Talk with Kim is, first of all, I love coffee, and the next best thing to coffee is coffee with friends. So plus there was the old Saturday Night Live sketch. I think it was Coffee Talk with Linda, but it was kind of a satire on of a bunch of older Jewish women that would sit around and they would shoot the breeze. And I think it was Mike Myers in that. So when I was thinking of what could be a good breakout session to Lessons from the Waiting Room to kind of elaborate more on some of the posts, there's only so much you can say when you're writing. And sometimes as you have conversations with people as a result of your blogging, then it brings up more things that can be added to the conversation. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to have that for people, and hopefully we could have some conversation. This is the first time. It's the inaugural run. Actually, it's the second time because I failed miserably at the first with no sound. So I wanted to talk a couple minutes here about my exposure to grief. What is grief? What does it look like? What does it do to our bodies? How can we not snap out of it, because there's no snapping out of it, but then how can we also help others that we see going through it? So I will also put some links in here. I had them in my original one, but I was trying to get back on real quick. So um, well, for me, I had no significant major losses when I was younger. I do remember my grandfather dying probably when I was, I want to say 9 or 10, maybe 8, 9, 6, 7, somewhere in that range. There wasn't much of a relationship there because, we lived farther away from them. But I do remember the last time seeing him was when we went to visit him in the hospital, and he had lung cancer, and um, he half of his face was just scaled over and just um, nasty is the best word I could think of. It's not actually the best word, but it's the only word that I could think of to describe what he looked like. I actually could probably describe it best to say he looked like a monster to me, and that, unfortunately, that's one of the last memories I have of seeing him and seeing him that way. And because I didn't have very many memories with him, that's kind of what's etched in my mind. So I do remember some other pleasant things about him. I was in their 50th wedding anniversary, Flower Girl, where they were renewing their vows. He would play his electric guitar as we would stand together and sing as a family when we would go visit. And he had this big mouth bass fish that you could like clap and it would like sing a song, and it would start to, I don't know, maybe some of my family members remember that, or maybe I'm just having a Kimmery, as they like to call it. And then I also remember probably when I was 10 or 11 that one of my uncles passed away suddenly of a brain aneurysm. And once again, I didn't know much about him. I knew it was a time that was supposed to be sad, and I did feel sadness. But as I've gotten older and have experienced different levels of grief, I know it was not to the level or extent as if I had really grown attached to him. So that's kind of been my extent. And a cat that my sister ran over and told me that it died of old age. I'm just spilling all my family secrets, partly because I know I asked him to check it out to see if I had volume this time. So, but talking about grief. So what is grief? I'd always thought about it as losing a family member, right? And that is a very significant loss. Like death is what I thought of with grief. As I was looking up some things, some resources, and I'm not a professional grief therapist. I'm not really, honestly, a professional anything. I am working on my master's degree towards clinical mental health counseling. And so a lot of this stuff I have learned through my training, but I do not have a specialization in it. And a lot of it I've learned from my own experience as I've gotten older. But as I've been doing some research just to have some things to talk about this evening and to be able to hopefully provide something helpful, I wanted to look at the broader scope of what grief is. So this source that I have is from WebMD. It describes grief as a natural response to losing someone or something that's important to you. You can feel a variety of emotions like sadness or loneliness. You might experience it for a number of different reasons. Maybe a loved one died, a relationship ended, or you lost your job, or other life changes like chronic illness or moving to a new home can also lead to grief. So these are not just things that, the length of grief can't really be determined for one specific person. It really depends on the level of connection that you've had with something that's been lost. I mean, for some of us, maybe your family is limited. Maybe your life is basically your job. And when your job changes, that is a huge loss. I know for me personally, that was one of the biggest griefs that I realized much later that I had with the last job that I left. It spent 10 years of my life completely invested in that place as a ministry and just poured every bit of what I had into that. And while I knew it was time to go, and while there was much toxic stress that came from that situation, the result, and I was happy to be done, afterwards, there was this almost a sense of depression that came about, and I couldn't figure out why I couldn't snap out of it. So and I realized much later, like I was grieving. And it took a little bit from that. And I'm maybe 6 years removed from that. And there's still times that something gets triggered in me. Dreams will trigger things for me sometimes too. But something important to realize is that everybody grieves differently. Some people like to throw themselves into their work, throw themselves into their hobbies. They don't like to stop, because once they stop, the loneliness, the sadness kicks in. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Different models of grief have different variations, different steps. One model that I've done more study with is called the Hubler-Ross model, and that's actually one of my most recent blog posts, and that gives 5 stages of grief. And if you can imagine grief as like a wadded ball of yarn, it's not pretty. There's no single. So when we say there's like 5 steps, it's not like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 numbered. It's all intertwined, and it's all different emotions, and it's all there's denial. Is this really happening? This can't be really happening. This is just a bad dream. Why is this happening? Anger. Maybe there's anger towards God. Especially as believers, we know that God controls all things. So sometimes, even though we wouldn't want to admit it, possibly, maybe one of our first reactions could be, okay, God, why did you let this happen? If everything works out for good, why have you allowed this? And there's times to ask God questions to gain a better understanding, but sometimes our anger is presented at God. It can be presented at people that just happen to be in our pathway, that it's not really directed at them, but they're the recipients of it. There's bargaining. Okay, God, if only this could have happened instead, or what if, or my favorite for myself was, okay, God, if you just give me a kid, then I will give them up to you, just like the Hannah prayer, and you got to be careful when you pray that way, because God did give me a child, and I did have to give them up, and I had to give them back. And that's kind of what God's plan was for that situation. And we have to be prepared to handle what we ask for. Depression. This is a deep sadness. It can include, obviously, crying. It can disrupt your sleep patterns. Decreases your appetite. You can feel emotionally overwhelmed. Your senses can feel overwhelmed. You're very regretful. You can feel very lonely. There's a helplessness, a hopelessness that comes from that. And something I want to make sure we understand with that, a believer can still be depressed and believe that God is still good. God is good, but circumstances really stink. And I think sometimes that we throw that stigma on believers that, if you're a good Christian, you won't ever be depressed. And that's just not. Sometimes there's physical restraints that, whether it's brain chemistry, biology, that can cause depression. That's not just because of a lack of faith or a strength in your Christian beliefs. And then there's acceptance. This is kind of where you get to the point, okay, like, I can understand this. I may not agree with it. I may not like it, but I can accept it's how it is, and I'm ready to move forward. So those are the 5, and the Kubler-Ross method model. But how long can it last? The experts say that it just depends on a number of things, like your age, your personality, your belief system, your support network. Think of the person who doesn't have that supportive network behind them. There's not the hope. They don't have the grounded. There's studies that show even just how spirituality in general, whether it's organized religion, can really ground a person to be able to help them and give them a sense of hope. Those of us that are Christians, we know that our source of hope is found in Christ alone, and that he can be that help to us even when our hearts are breaking. There's no set time. We can't rush our own grief. We can't rush someone else's grief. So one of the things would be to decide, okay, I'm experiencing grief. I'm having all these things happen. When do I know if I need professional help? Because here's the thing, grief is a natural process. Everyone is going to experience grief. Different people experience it at different depths based on, like we said, personality, and the complexity of their grief. If there's a compounded grief, like let's say you've lost 2-3 people that have been close to you, and then on top you have this happen, and then you're moving, there's lots of life changes. It causes stress in our bodies. It produces more adrenaline. We'll talk more about the effects of stress on our body in just a minute. But these things can add to a complexity of grief that can actually make it more difficult for us to recover. And those types of griefs typically lend themselves to needing professional help. So if you have problems keeping your normal routine, like going to work or cleaning the house, if you have severe feelings of depression, hopelessness, helplessness, you have thoughts that life is not worth living or of harming yourself, if you have any inability to stop blaming yourself, this is when you need professional help. And I will tell you, I was at that point about 2 years ago, not the harming myself, but every single one of those things for myself. I was at that point. And it's not the first time that I felt that way. But it was the time that I finally realized I can't do this on my own. Holding it in secret is not helping me. I need to get the help that I need. So, so what can we do? Here's something interesting. Let me talk. Sorry, my dog is going crazy. Sorry, like I said before, they're doing fireworks in our neighborhood because they canceled all of the community fireworks. And my dog has his own sense of PSD around fireworks, and my husband's not around right now. So hopefully I can keep him from barking. But looking at some of the physical effects of grief, and this is another article that, I'm just going to touch briefly on this. There are grief can cause headaches, dry mouth, shortness of breath, which you should be calling your doctor about, chest pain, nausea, stomach pain, a lessened appetite. Sometimes it can also have the opposite effect and give you an increased appetite, especially depending on your coping skills and your mechanisms, and fatigue. The really interesting thing is looking at coping mechanisms. There are some times that people get caught in a process of ruminating. I don't know if you're familiar. You probably are. I'm not trying to be condescending, but with ruminating, if you think about like how a cow chews its cud and how it digests, it swallows things, brings it back up, it chews over it. Ruminating is kind of the same thing. It's continually processing, typically like negative thoughts over and over in our head. I tend to do this a lot. But rumination or repetitive negative self-focused thinking is actually a way to avoid our problems. This is a coping mechanism. People who ruminate shift attention away from painful truths and focus on negative material that is less threatening than the truths they want to avoid. This pattern of thinking is strongly associated with depression. It's almost like a continual beating down. That can come about when a person is struggling with grieving. This is something that I struggle with, and I've had to seek professional help with to be able to reframe my thinking, to be able to see how my thinking is faulty and to get things on the right path. And telling a person who struggles with this of just like, you need to change your thoughts, like without giving them something to help them, without helping direct that, is not extremely helpful. So just so you know, coming from someone who struggles with that, I can try to all I want, but until I have developed the skills to be able to do that for myself, people just telling me to do it, it doesn't help me. So as an individual personally, how can you cope with grief? We've seen some of the physical effects of grief. And one thing I will say, when a person gets to a point where they have such extremely complicated grief, it can actually lead to heart disease. And if you hear of someone that dies of a broken heart, there is scientific evidence that complicated grief, that toxic stress, it continues to increase blood pressure. It increases lots of adrenaline that can cause, it can combine, cause heart disease, and can actually eventually cause death. So if you are struggling with grief right now, what can you do? There's some helpful tips I wanted to give you, and then I wanted to talk for a minute. And if you have a question or would like to say something, please chime in the comments. So we've talked about what happens if you think you need help. How do you know? But if you're not to the point where you need help, or you're still struggling to say, hey, I need help. Speaking of help, I think my dog needs help. First of all, give yourself time. Be patient with yourself. Let yourself go through the grieving process and know that it's normal. There's no telling how long it's going to take. And you might be to the point, the last stage, where you are feeling like, hey, I'm ready to move on. And then you're in the store and you hear that song that maybe it was your favorite song to sing with your mother or your father or your brother or your uncle or the child that you lost, right? It can bring back those memories. It can bring back those thoughts. It can bring back that sadness. Then it can bring back the anger. It can bring back the, oh, is this really happening? So it can be triggered, and you can kind of fall back into some of those things, but no, it's still a complicated process. Okay. So give yourself time, give yourself some understanding, talk to others. The hardest thing when you're going through depression and grief, this is how my counselor explained it to me when she was trying to describe myself to me one day. She said, because I withdraw, my coping mechanism is, you know what? I'm flight. I'm out of here. I'm pulling back. I'm done. I'm shutting down. I'm shutting off. But yet I see the things around me and I want to be involved, but I don't know how to reach out. And she said, Kim, it's kind of like you're in this well, that you're protected. You feel protected. You feel comfort in this well of protection, that you can keep things out, but yet you see life out above you. And you want to just reach out and be part of that sometimes, but you got to come out of the safety of the well that you've put yourself in, because that pit is lonely. And so if you're the person who's going through grief or depression right now, you have to try. I know it's difficult, and this is going to be something we say on the other side for those of you trying to help someone who's grieving, but don't isolate yourself as much as you want to. Okay. Whoever is in your life, try to reach out. Try to stay present in the here and now. Okay. Don't allow yourself to shut down. Take care of yourself. This includes eating regularly, not overeating, but eating regularly, trying to get exercise when you can. I'm not one to speak about this because I'm awful at exercise, but I found that taking a walk, even just getting outside when the sun is out, it helps. Okay. It releases endorphins in your body to be able to get some exercise, to get out and to be in nature. Return to hobbies. Return when you're ready. Find those hobbies that give you that release. Shiloh, just 1 second. I'm sorry. So return to your hobbies. You like music, pick up your guitar, go to your keyboard. You like gardening, get outside, enjoy something. Not as a method to completely shut off everything you're dealing with, but as a method to kind of release some of what's going on inside of you. Join a support group. Or if you go to church, find a group of, maybe find some other people who have lost. Find some people that would have something in common with you. So last thing I wanted to mention was what to do when you have someone in your life that's grieving. And before I transition into that last thing, I forgot about a quote that I found that just really sat with me. And it's by Rebecca Ray. So what do you do if you're going through grief, dealing with difficult feelings? Sit with it. Sit with it. Sit with it. Even though you want to run, sit with it. Even when it's heavy and difficult, sit with it. Even if you're not quite sure of the way through, sit with it. Healing happens by feeling. So if you don't give yourself that time and that space, not to live there, but the time and the space to say, I'm hurt. I don't know what to do. Pour your heart out to God. He knows all these things that we're feeling, even if you're upset with him. He already knows it. I mean, you can read all through Psalms, and David's like, okay, God, how long are you going to do this? How long are you going to allow these people to come after me? Pour your heart out to him. Sit with it. Feel it. Because that's the only way that you're going to be able to process it and heal it. So the last bit here, how do you help someone who's going through it? The first thing, we've already mentioned it, healing and grieving does not have a set time limit. Telling a person to get over it and move on is not helpful. So it can, I had a friend, and I don't know if my friend's going to watch this, so please forgive me if you're going to watch this. And my friend gave a prayer request one day in a staff meeting, and gave a prayer request for comfort about losing some family members. And then a well-meaning person afterwards came to my friend and said, it's been a couple years, hasn't it? Like, it wasn't just recent. And the thing is, grief doesn't have a time limit. You can still feel that same grief 5 and 6 years later. It might not be as bad, right? It might not be as oppressive, but you can still feel it. So we can't minimize. We have to show empathy. And even if we don't agree with where the person's at, having empathy, I learned a whole lot about this in my current class on counseling techniques, and as a counselor, being empathetic with people. What does empathy mean? What is empathy? What is it not? Okay, it's not sympathy. It's not becoming so involved in someone else's story that you yourself get depressed. Okay, but in order to empathize, this is a quote by Brené Brown. In order to empathize with someone's experience, you must be willing to believe them as they see it, and not how you imagine their experience to be. There's going to be things that your friend goes through that you can't even imagine because you've not experienced it. I've not experienced the loss of a parent, and I know people who have. And during that time, when I want to reach out, and it's not my time to compare my grief with someone else's, but I can sit with them, and I can know that it hurts. And I can know that it's a sorrowful time. And what I started doing was asking people, how can I support you? So yes, realizing you can't rush someone else's healing. Another thing, I mentioned this thing about being in a well. I know in my deepest times of depression, I couldn't reach out. First of all, I didn't want people to think poorly of me. I didn't want people to think that I was a bad Christian because, it's all about me. I'm throwing myself a pity party. And to some extent, it was focused on me. But I was struggling with things that I could not get out of my head, and I needed to get help with that. So there were days I felt like, and it's not a reflection that I have bad friends or bad family, because I don't. I have loving friends and loving family. But there were days that I'm like, man, if people only knew, if someone would just reach out to me, because I feel like I can't reach out, but I need it. We as loved ones and friends, and we know someone's going through a grieving process, big life changes, they've lost someone. Those are times we can know that someone's going to be grieving. Don't put the work on them to reach out. They need to try. But sometimes in those darkest times, they can't reach out. So how can we help them? What are things that we would know someone would need? Like gas cards, right? If they're going to be going places, meals. We need to make sure they're eating, right? So maybe you get them a DoorDash card. Then they don't even have to leave the house to go get food. There's so many ways. You can send them flowers, send them a note. And I know sometimes people just don't know what to say, right? You don't want to say the wrong thing, so we decide not to say anything at all. And honestly, friends, that's probably one of the worst things we could do, because when we choose to say nothing, we kind of give the impression that we're not thinking about the person, right? If you've been there and you've experienced that, you know exactly. Yeah, sitting with them. I love that. You can't know how they're feeling, but you can sit with them and you can love them. And we all know what sadness feels like, right? That's true empathy. Sit with people, recognize your friends, do the legwork. It does require that we do the legwork. So, you know, these are some things that I know I've learned from my own experience, and I will admit that I often don't do as much as I should for people that are grieving. Partly because sometimes I'm still wrapped up in my own grief. Sometimes I'm wrapped up in my own feelings of depression and anxiety. But if you've experienced the help from someone else, then you know how desperately desired that it is to be that for someone else. So, you know, those are just some thoughts that I had. You know, we right now have a demographic, a cultural demographic in our country. I don't know if those are the right words. That there's a lot of hurting people around us on all different sides, right? I mean, we have all different types of beliefs in our country going on right now. We have people, when I've seen this cultural take of what's going on right now, I know for me as a person, something that I've been grieving is the more knowledge I gain about even some of the past dealings in our country. I grieve some of the things that, you know, it's shattered my illusion of the perfect country that maybe I thought I grew up in. And don't get me wrong, I love America. We have a great country, but we're not perfect. And so I have seen some things. Shiloh, come here. I think Shiloh is grieving the loss of the bone, the chew that he hid, and now he can't get to it, so he's struggling. But what I'm trying to say is I think we are grieving different losses here, and this is a time that, if nothing else, we could be united in our grief. There are things that have happened in our country that should sadden us on all sides. We don't treat people as we should. We don't treat people in love and in kindness. It is there are reports, there's research that's been done that shows as soon as people speak with a different accent as they come into America, that we often view them as less intelligent. There's hurts all the way around. There's grief over losses of dreams, of losses. This is a time that we can say, you know what, we're different, but we've all experienced grief, and how can we be a help to one another? How can we support each other? We've got grieving law enforcement families. We've got grieving families who've lost community and businesses, and lots of businesses that have probably starting to go under because of COVID. So this is the time when we're going to have a lot of people around us that are grieving. And so hopefully we can be more mindful of how to just be present for those people and how to process our own grief so that we can actually heal. And God doesn't waste that. He actually tells us that we go through those things so that we can help those behind us that haven't reached that part of the journey yet, right? Maybe they're in the valley between the next grief. We go through those things just as Jesus went through things like that on the earth, to be the perfect mediator, to completely understand what we will ever experience. And he gives that, honestly, that grief to us as a gift so that we can help others who are going to go through it. And that's what the body of Christ is all about. So, you know, if you don't belong to the body of Christ, this is the time, this is the place to be able to make your way into the family of Christ. He is truly the only source of healing for your grief. So thank you so much for joining me. Sorry if you tried to watch it before and it didn't work. It's been a long day, but hopefully I've got this figured out now. Thank you so much for your comments. Right. Yeah. So I was seeing the comments left there that that sometimes all you need is to be that person that can be there and just sit with them and love them. Oh, hi. Yes, thank you guys for joining. I really appreciate it. Next time, I was going to say, if you guys have any thoughts, I know a family member gave me an idea of talking about ice cream or the Gators or something like that. I don't know much about the Gators. I do know a lot about ice cream. I just bought an ice cream maker, and my first ice cream, it was a sorbet, a dark chocolate espresso sorbet. So, you can always ice cream is great. Yeah, it is. So it can always give me some topics. I'd love to talk more with you guys. But thank you for joining in. Appreciate it. And good to see you guys on the chat. So have a great night, guys.